Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. We're just finishing up getting everybody seated, and I want you to go ahead and enjoy your lunch. But as I look at our schedule, we want to have time for our eminent keynote speaker and some question and answer with him, so I think we better get going, and we'll all get seated as quickly as we can. My name's George Lucas. I'm not that other guy. I happen to hold a chair here in ethics that's generously funded by the class of 1984, and my friends and colleagues, of whom there are very few left, I think, usually get tired of me having to explain that I'm not the other guy. But now I'm explaining that I'm not Ed Barrett. I used to hold the job that Ed now holds, or a job very similar, more or less similar, but in the performance of it, far less rather than more. In terms of what Ed has managed to pull together as a program for us over these next few days. He's done a remarkable job, and we're all in his debt. And I say this as I introduce our keynote speaker because Ed, who is always thoughtful, collaborative, and deferential, popped into my office a few weeks ago and said, "Do you think we could ask or invite Walzer?" And I looked at all of the people that would manage to get so far, David Roden and Jeff McMahon, and just it was this sort of star-studded cast of colleagues, and wondered, on the one hand, Professor Walzer can probably not refuse any invitation which is not submitted to him. On the other hand, he's probably one of those people who's even busier in retirement than he was when on active duty. So I don't want to set our sights too high, but go for it. So Ed went out, about 2 or 3 days later, came back in and said, "We got Walzer." And we did our dance and our high fives and so forth. And then we found out what it was going to cost, both Ed and Professor Walzer, who was speaking in New York last night. He's teaching at New York University this year and speaking at a fundraiser for Dissent magazine. Had to give that talk and then hop the Amtrak milk run down to Washington, leaving New York at 9 o'clock. Got in at after 12 last evening. Ed picked him up at the BWI station, drove him to the hotel where he managed to get, I hope, a few hours sleep, and Ed crashed in the basement of my house downstairs, so he'd be ready to turn around 5 hours later and come in and run this. So that's the kind of work that goes in behind the scenes. And to both our eminent keynote speaker and our hardworking Director of Strategy and Research at the Stockdale Center, we're deeply grateful. You hardly need to introduce Professor Walzer to you, but let me just say a few things about him. He's published, as you know, more than 27, almost 30 books, and written more than 300 articles on a wide variety of topics in political theory and moral philosophy, ranging from political obligation, human rights and justice, to war, nationalism and ethnicity, radicalism, economic justice, and the welfare state. His articles and interviews frequently appear in the world's foremost newspapers and journals. Among his most renowned books, known to most of us here, are Obligations, Just and Unjust Wars, Arguing About War, Thinking Politically, Spheres of Justice, The Company of Critics, and On Toleration. Professor Walzer graduated summa cum laude from Brandeis University in 1956 with a BA in history. He studied at the University of Cambridge on a Fulbright fellowship and later completed doctoral work at Harvard, earning his PhD in government in 1961. He has served over the years on the faculty at both Princeton and Harvard and has been for more than 2 decades professor in the School of Social Sciences at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where he is now professor emeritus. He is co-editor of the journal I mentioned earlier, Dissent, a contributing editor for the New Republic, co-editor and contributor to several volumes in a series he helped inaugurate, a comprehensive, collaborative project focused on the history of Jewish political thought entitled The Jewish Political Tradition. Professor Walzer delivered the Stutt Lecture at the United States Naval Academy in November of 2002, commenting at that time on the prospects for the looming war in Iraq. It was entitled The Triumph of Just War Theory and the Dangers of Success. It's a privilege to welcome him once again to the shores of the Severn. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Michaeal Walzer.
Thank you, George. as you just heard, I've been in this business for a long time, and I still get very nervous when I am speaking to an audience like this one, which includes many people who know a lot more about war than I do. So this is an argument that I will make today with some humility. My subject is, I want to address the question, can the good guys win? And it's a question raised by protests from soldiers, our soldiers in Afghanistan, who say that the current rules of engagement make it more difficult to fight and more dangerous to fight and more difficult to win than it should be. And those are protests that we need to take very seriously. In some sense, the most important challenge to just war theory is this practical challenge, not philosophical, but a practical challenge. If we fight according to these principles, we can't win. We want to be the good guys, the just warriors, but if we fight justly, we will lose the war. Now, I suppose that this sort of thing has been said before. Certainly, winning armies violated the rules often enough, and they always claimed that the violations were militarily necessary. Today, however, breaking the rules is especially necessary, so it is said, for two reasons. First, the rising tide of human rights agitation and the new status and strength of international courts have made the rules far more stringent than they were in the old days. And second, the increasing importance of non-state actors, insurgent and terrorist organizations, has raised questions about how the burden of the rules is distributed. If the distribution is unfair, won't the burdened fighters be forced to break the rules and justified in doing so? In what is called asymmetric warfare between high-tech armies and low-tech insurgent forces, the insurgents argue that they are militarily weak, and so it is impossible for them to win unless they hide among their own civilians and launch terror attacks against the enemy's civilians. And their enemies claim that it isn't possible to respond effectively to those attacks without inflicting harm on the civilian population that exceeds what is permitted by the standards of jus in bello as they are commonly understood today. There isn't any way of going after the insurgents that does not produce excessive or disproportionate civilian casualties. So one side says that the rules penalize them for their weakness, so they have to break the rules. The other side says that their enemies are not only breaking the rules, but also exploiting them, and the only possible response is to break them again. Now, I'm going to engage these arguments, but there is another argument that comes ahead of it, which my own rules of engagement require me to take up first. What happens on the ground is radically affected by what happens in what we might think of as the moral political surround. There's an ongoing debate about what the rules are and how they are interpreted and applied in wartime. And it isn't only soldiers and insurgents who participate in the debate. All of us, citizens of a democratic state, we are also participants. And what we say and do counts significantly in determining how both sides fight. So let me begin with an outline of the moral rules, because the argument I want to make depends on that outline. If we understand the morality of war rightly, and if we persuade enough other people to understand it rightly, the claim that it isn't possible to win within the rules will fail. So this is a practical project in response to a practical challenge. I want to get things right. I also want to have some effect on the moral political surround. The crucial principle that underlies jus in bello is that civilians must be shielded from the violence of the battle. That means that they can't be directly targeted. Terrorism is ruled out from the beginning, which is what the terrorists complain about. It also means that injuries inflicted on civilians indirectly in the course of the fighting, what's called collateral damage, must be limited. The standard understanding of the limits is that the injury to civilians must not be disproportionate to the value of the military target. The point is to permit the attack so long as the target is really important and the risk to innocent people falls within a reasonable range. But important and reasonable are vague terms, and so proportionality turns out to be a highly elastic principle. It can be exploited in both directions to justify large-scale injury to civilians and to criticize any injury at all. And it offers little resistance to either of these uses. Consider an example from World War II. Here is a factory making tanks for the German war effort. Given the aiming devices available in 1943, an attack from the air will almost certainly kill some number, and possibly a very large number, of civilians living in working-class neighborhoods around the factory. The factory hasn't been put in a working-class neighborhood for the sake of civilian cover. That's where they put factories before workers had automobiles. And given the importance of destroying the factory, the deaths of these neighbors will be considered, and were in fact considered, reasonable and therefore acceptable. Now, if that seems a relatively easy case, there are many more that are not quite like that, but are close enough or can be made to look close enough, and then again, the deaths will be considered acceptable. On the other hand, there are many military operations in asymmetric wars that don't have that kind of importance, though they may still be called militarily necessary, like seizing a terrorist cadre or hitting a rocket launching team. But suppose that the cadre is hiding in the middle of a village in Pakistan, and the rocket launching team is firing from the front of an apartment building in Gaza. In these cases, the operation is likely to produce civilian deaths, and these aren't so easy to defend. For many observers, they are not defensible at all. The tendency of lawyers and human rights advocates in recent years has been to focus on cases like these and to insist that any civilian deaths are disproportionate. But the war on terrorism consists in large part of small-scale engagements of just this kind. It seems to follow then that terrorism is immoral and fighting against the terrorists isn't morally possible. Now, the first of these propositions is incontestable, but that doesn't mean that the insurgents are prevented from winning by the rules of war. There are other strategies available to them, ranging from attacks on military targets and police forces, which are never literally impossible, to general strikes and massive civil disobedience. Indeed, in every insurgent organization that we know of, in all the organizations fighting for what's called national liberation, in all of these organizations, militants argued among themselves about what ought to be done, and many of them defended one or another of the alternative strategies. It wasn't obvious to these militants that there was nothing else to do but launch a terrorist campaign. So terrorism may not, in fact, be the only way to win. And once we consider what winning means, it may not be a way to win at all. In the Algerian War of the 1950s, that's an early example of asymmetry, the Algerian militants insisted in all their manifestos that they were fighting to create an independent and democratic state. But it is an old argument that terrorism will not lead to democracy. The band of terrorists is an elite group that preempts any popular mobilization and regularly produces authoritarian rule, first in the movement and then in the state. The Algerian case now provides strong empirical evidence for this argument.